Revolutions Per Minute is a weekly radio show from the New York City chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America, recorded live at WBAI 99.5 in Brooklyn every Tuesday at 5. RPM is about doing the work to build a democratic socialist future. Every week, hear the latest news, analysis, and organizing experience from the minds and hearts of activists fighting every day in NYC. Join the movement at socialists.nyc.
Happy Tuesday, New York. You're listening to Revolutions Per Minute on WBAI, a socialist radio show and podcast from members of the New York City Democratic Socialists of America. The Democratic Socialists of America is the largest socialist organization in the United States with 56,000 members nationwide, and New York City DSA is its biggest chapter. Today, we'll be talking about political education. You know, it's the foundation of every activist toolkit. And so today we'll explore some ways that New York City DSA is reaching out to make understanding of the history of our nation, of our economy, and the collective struggle more accessible across the city. You know, what is the foundation of the work that we're doing? But first, we have the headlines.
This is Kyle Sorrell with the headlines, brought to you by The Thorn. Last week, Politico wrote about NYC DSA's rank-and-file strategy to push the city's unions to the left. One of the most conservative and Cuomo-aligned unions in the city, the Hotel Trades Council, is believed to have recently ordered its staffers to spy on New York City DSA chapter meetings. Despite the fact that rank-and-file is a strategy used by the left for generations and discussed at length at DSA's national convention, union bureaucrats were apparently surprised that its members aim to support more progressive and pro-worker union building. This past Monday, Gregory Russ began his tenure as NYCHA chairperson. Formerly head of Minneapolis's Public Housing Authority, Russ has faced criticism for embracing the controversial federal RAD program, which allows private nonprofit developers to control public housing units through funding for repairs. Russ replaces former NYCHA chairperson Shola Olatoye, who resigned in April following a lead paint inspection scandal. Russ will be paid an annual salary of over $400,000. A 73% increase from his predecessors. Last Monday, Governor Andrew Cuomo signed legislation that will expand workplace harassment protections in New York State. It removes the standard that harassment be, quote-unquote, severe and pervasive in order to be legally actionable. The new laws also require all employment contract non-disclosure agreements to allow employees to file complaints of sexual harassment or discrimination, and extends the statute of limitations to file sexual harassment claims with the Division of Human Rights from 1 to 3 years. Thousands of renters are owed back payments after New York's highest court ruled that because the landlords reaped millions of dollars in tax benefits under a 1995 program, their tenants should have had stabilized leases. The program was meant to enable lower and moderate income residents to live in Lower Manhattan by incentivizing developers to convert office buildings into residences and reserve some units as quote-unquote affordable. Some members of the Progressive Coalition that supported Tiffany Caban are looking to challenge district leader incumbencies in Queens in 2020. The Queens Democratic Party is one of the most hierarchical party organizations in the city, with relatively little turnover among its elites. Quote, "This project is not about what decisions are made by county and not about who is making the decisions. It is about how they are being made," Bright Lim, a longtime Queens organizer, said. "Until the process is made truly democratic, the who and what are going to change, and we're going to always be fighting one battle at a time. If we change how the decisions are made, we will have transformation," he said. Politico also reported on the Brooklyn DSA Electoral Working Group's plans to contest 2020 state legislative primaries. Votes are being held next month on whether or not to endorse in almost 10 different Senate and Assembly districts. Find your local branch to get involved in this exciting process. That's it for the headlines. Back to you, Lee.
Our daily headlines are brought to you by The Thorn, an incredible weekly newsletter by New York City DSA Electoral Working Group covering local politics and radical activism. You can subscribe at thethorn.nyc. You're listening to Revolutions Per Minute on WBAI. I am Lee Zishi. I use she, her pronoun. And today we're talking about political education and what that means for the NYC DSA chapter. We are joined by Ava Sotomayor of the North Brooklyn Political Education Education Working Group, Benjamin Kodacek of the North Brooklyn Political Education Working Group, and an active member of almost every New York City DSA reading group, Jeremy Cohen. Let's start with you, Eva. Can you talk a little bit? I like to really just start with people like, how did you get into DSA and democratic socialism?
Sure. So I got into DSA right after the Trump inauguration. I was in grad school at the time, and it was a lot of reading about how the world was messed up. And I was like thinking, like, well, I should probably join and do something about why the world is messed up. So I got involved. Oh, okay. Sorry. So I got involved right after the inauguration, and I originally started working with the Immigration Justice Working Group, and then eventually got involved with the North Brooklyn Political Education.
And what about you, Ben?
It took me a while after the election to realize that DSA was the place that real political transformation was potentially taking place. A lot of my friends were getting involved, and I had started doing a lot of design work and reading on my own and with various groups before that, but I decided to move those skills and abilities to DSA around maybe the summer after Trump was elected.
And how about you, Jeremy?
So first of all, full disclosure, I'm also on the North Brooklyn Political Education Working Group. So
rolling deep today.
Yeah, so this is North Brooklyn Represent, and maybe we can talk a little bit about North Brooklyn's, being really developed as a chapter, I think, in that regard, or as a branch, though we're all, in general, working together in political education in New York City. Anyways, so how I got involved with DSA, I've been a socialist for a long time, been around various groups on the left, been involved in Occupy Wall Street, was an academic, so studying how horrible capitalism is, but definitely, just wasn't part of a group. A lot of the groups didn't seem right. And then I was both, 2016 was such a big year. I was both inspired by Bernie Sanders and what he had shown was possible, that socialism was not this kind of little club that me and a few friends belonged to, but actually it was like politics that spoke to ordinary working people all across this country and also elsewhere in the world. So that definitely changed my sense of what was possible. And then when Trump won, it changed my sense of kind of how urgent things were and how crazy and horrible things could get. So that weekend, I remember I was at a conference, and I texted like an old friend of mine who we'd been both socialists for a long time. And I was like, I think we need to join an organization again. And he was like, yep. And I was like, I think it's got to be the DSA. And he's like, yep. And I joined shortly thereafter.
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of people that we have on the show, people who are now, like neck deep in organizing, joined, I think, around the similar time. And I think a lot of people like recognize that capitalism is the problem. And at least like for me, like that was my first step. And then I eventually was like, okay, well, like DSA is the group that I see doing the work, but like actually understanding like, okay, what does it mean to be a democratic socialist and what's the history of it? So I think that's really exciting that that's what, the Political Education Working Group is working on. And I'm actually really excited about this episode that we can really kind of dig more into that and just kind of start peeling back some of those layers, because people have heard a lot of these terms. But yeah, it's exciting that you're all doing the education work of organizing. So Ava, let's talk a little bit first. You're a member of a couple caucuses within DSA. Can you tell us what those are, and just kind of then how the Political Education Working Group, what kind of work do you do with caucuses across DSA?
Sure. So I would say the main caucus right now that I'm doing political education group is the DSA Boricua Socialist Caucus. It started very informally as kind of a Twitter DM with a bunch of Puerto Rican comrades across all the U.S. Kind of talking about, just how socialism could be applied to, to the Caribbean and the history, and how for many of us learning about this history in like the Caribbean and Latin America radicalized us. So it started out as like the kind of like this little DM that kind of turned into a formal group, and we actually had our first meetup at the convention in Atlanta, and we had people from like Portland, Oregon, to people in like city council in Chicago, which was really amazing. So two of our members put forth the decolonization resolution that passed at convention. It says that DSA, stands in solidarity with decolonizing Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Guam, and giving all these territories like the right to self-determination. So now, I know like decolonization is like such a big word. So right now we're working on how we can make that, bring this theory back to our chapters, to our locals. How do we inform people about the history of Puerto Rico, the Caribbean, and like other colonized countries? Like, how do we unlearn things that we learned in school about the U.S. and about empire? So that's a really cool project that is in the beginning stages, but I am very excited about. I will talk about night school a little bit later, but we're having a session on that, which I'm really excited to also bring to North Brooklyn.
And why is like learning that history, the history of Puerto Rico and the history of colonization, how is that important kind of for like understanding decolonization and then the work that these different caucuses are doing?
Sure. So I was personally radicalized kind of in around middle school when I read excerpts from like The Open Veins of Latin America by Eduardo Galeano, and I kind of learned like how it differed from like what was being told about my history book, and how U.S. intervention had affected all of these countries, and we're talking about how socialism doesn't work, but if you look at the if you have the CIA like taking down dictators, like of course it's not going to work. And also just like unlearning so much of like what was about like the narrative that was shown to me in school, and then reading those alongside kind of just helped me like open my eyes and be like, oh well, there's maybe there's something to challenge about like all of these of what I'm learning in school. So I think it's important. We've been talking about how being Puerto Rican, it's like a continual process, and also like sharing that with our comrades. It's important because we can't fully fight for something if you don't know the history of what you're fighting for.
Yeah, I once was at a conference where I heard some really great advice from an indigenous man, and he was just talking about how all of our minds are colonized, in different levels of that, and just like accepting that, like, oh, there's certain ways that I've been taught to think about things, and that's actually colonization.
Yeah.
So if there are people that are maybe interested in the history of this, are there any things that you recommend that people read? You mentioned some of the stuff that you read early.
So Open Veins of Latin America by Eduardo Galeano, I think it's a book that I recommend to everyone, and I think if you talk to me for about 10 minutes, I will probably recommend that you read it, even if it's like the introduction. It's just like this amazing overview. I think Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind is a little bit more academic, but it's a really, really good intro that has also kind of talks about a little bit about how you learn how like we are colonized, and like how language also goes along with it. And then Amy Cesar's discourse on decolonization is also a big one that I would recommend.
And like, what's kind of been the response when you like bring up, just even this term decolonization and learning about the history? How have people in DSA responded to this kind of education that you're bringing to the table?
So it's definitely like new. A lot of people kind of are not scared, but they like. It sounds like a very academic term, and it originated in academia. So I guess a lot of people are like, oh, but isn't that, like really, it doesn't sound like really academic-y? But I feel like the response that I've gotten so far has been really positive, and people really want to learn about these histories. I'm really excited to continue doing that moving forward.
Yeah, thanks so much for that work. You're listening to Revolutions Per Minute on listener-sponsored WBAI in New York City, broadcasting at 99.5 FM and streaming on your favorite podcast app. To connect with us after the show, you can email us at revolutionsnyc@gmail.com or sign up for our newsletter, and you can always find us on Twitter at NYCRPM. I'm Lee Zishi. I use she, her pronouns, and today we're talking about political education. The history behind, we talk about organizing a lot on this show, but there's a lot of history and education that goes into that. So Ben, I want to talk a little bit about something called DSA Night School. What is DSA Night School?
Sure. So Night School is a project that is running in North Brooklyn. Currently, we're on hiatus, but we just completed a year. It has predecessors in Philadelphia and in Central Brooklyn. where this project was started first. Although the original beginnings of night school, I believe, started with a day school that Jeremy helped organize years back, and then some Philadelphia people came to and thought was cool and wanted to make into a year-long course. So it's kind of a feedback loop of political education across different areas of different chapters. So yeah, night school is a year-long course. We try to connect up the theory and history of socialism with the practice that DSA activists are doing on a daily basis, and we cover all sorts of introductory topics on economics and politics, but more specifically as well on issues that are related to the campaigns we're working on. So Green New Deal or healthcare or elections, etc. And yeah, we just try to make them as accessible as possible, but also substantial enough so that members can gain a deeper perspective on what they're fighting for and how to do it.
Jeremy, maybe could you tell us a little bit about this first day school and how that went and why you felt kind of it was necessary to do something like that?
Sure. This goes back to the old days of 2016, I think. It feels like ancient history in DSA now. But so it was when there was just one Brooklyn branch, and there was a political education committee, and we were, it was a time where DSA had grown so much so fast, and just the political education group was trying to coordinate a million things. And just, as we were starting so many new projects, we kind of saw our mission as being, in part, a place where people who were involved in a whole bunch of different activities could come together and talk about, okay, what are our core beliefs as socialists? Like what, so I'm working on Green New Deal, and you're working on immigration justice, and you're working on housing, and so, but kind of where do we come all together? So we saw political education to some degree as that, and also what I think we've all been talking about here, like trying to bring the history to bear, the things that you don't learn when you're canvassing. You learn a lot when you're canvassing, probably most things you need to know as a socialist, but there are things like just what happened to Salvador Allende that you just really, you need to learn, you need to come together, you need to study. And the left has always been characterized by a vibrant culture of debate and learning and discussion. So our probably biggest project as that group, as the Brooklyn-wide thing, was a day school that was on sort of like the history of the left in America. So we had like a night program on the old left of the 30s. We had a day program on the new left, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, especially in the women's movement. And then we had an afternoon program on like the 70s and kind of what happened to the left, and then a panel at the end of the day that DSA people would recognize, Bianca Cunningham, and I'm trying to remember who else was on it. Others appeared on to talk about kind of contemporary issues on the left coming out of Occupy and Black Lives Matter, the movements, and kind of DSA. So that was a day-long programming, and we started trying to produce some literature. Like I co-wrote a pamphlet on gay liberation, queer socialism. I always forget what the title is. It's something like queer socialism, not rainbow capitalism, something like that. So I co-wrote that pamphlet with Ben Serby from South Brooklyn. And so, that was sort of the beginning. And then when the branches broke up, each of the branches has been kind of developing its own political education culture that comes out of particular needs of the branch, but as much as possible trying to also share resources. And so, as Ben said, Central Brooklyn had started their night school, and they went only for 8 weeks, and then we kind of piggybacked and started ours.
Yeah, so Ben, recently night school just had a graduation. What was kind of the measure of success for the graduates?
So for the graduates or the program itself?
Well, I mean, you can talk about both, really.
I think I've never seen political education events as large as our night school events. We had regularly, at max, a number of sessions that had around 60 people. Our smallest, I think, was around 20. Usually it was somewhere in between. And there were a number of people who stuck with night school and came to many sessions. A number of people whose first interaction with DSA or socialism was through night school. And a number of those people went on to be more active in the organization afterwards. So I think those are measures of success that I feel proud of.
And you're saying that this session just ended. Are there chances that night school will start back up again?
Yeah, we're already developing the next year. It's going to start in about a month. And hopefully more people will come, new people. The syllabus is going to be improved. It's going to be broken up into different quarters this time to give people a little bit of structure. And we've learned a lot of things from last year. We're going to try some new things. And I think it'll be a good program.
If people are interested in attending, what's the best way for them to find out about it?
Yeah, so you can email, I guess you could email me at, my last name is kind of difficult to spell, but it's BKODITSCHEK@gmail.com. And I'll connect you up with the North Brooklyn Night School.
Awesome. And you guys have kind of, talked about this a lot, but, the curriculum of the North Brooklyn Night School is incredibly expansive. It covers topics from Marxist economics, mass incarceration, the affordable housing crisis, the history of the labor movement, the history of other unionist movements. It goes on and on and on. I don't know, Jeremy, if you want to take this question, or Ben, but what is sort of like the guiding lens through which you tackle, each of the topics every week?
I think... Yeah, that's an interesting question, actually. I think one way is we try to pair kind of a more theoretical reading, like a reading that's going deeper into an analysis of why things are the way they are. So if we're reading about, healthcare, organizing around healthcare, it's well, what is the actual structure of the American healthcare system? And can activists become more articulate in being able to say how it's structured the way it is, how it came to be that way, and, a little more than just we all think it sucks and we want to change it, which is the fundamental. But then it's kind of the more analytical stuff. So I think we usually try to have a more theoretical piece that gives that analysis, and then something that ties that closely to our campaigns, where we get to discuss how does this affect how we think strategically about things. I think where possible we've tried to include also debates on the left about various issues, about what's next. So in the housing one, we kind of talked about universal rent control and social housing and, public housing, and what's the relationship between the two, and what are we pushing for, and is it both, and what's within the short-term horizon, what's within the long-term horizon. And those are the kinds of things that I feel are not questions you have when you're canvassing, generally, because you're involved really deeply in a campaign, but they're questions that we as DSAers want to be asking kind of all the time, and empowering as many of our members to ask as much as possible, because then they too feel more confident when they go to the doors about the issues and why they think a certain campaign is the right campaign, and also more empowered to think more broadly about what comes next when we finish a campaign, we just, amazingly did with universal rent control, right? So these questions all become suddenly more relevant, oh, what's next?
Yeah, you kind of just touched on it a little bit about, how this knowledge then kind of relates to the actual organizing, the door knocking. But, how important do you think it is to have this kind of background? Because I feel that's something I'm missing right now. I know okay, I got into this because I do work, with fossil fuels, and I could see how capitalism was destroying people's lives. And then, it was oh, well, the people that are actually out in the streets, supporting people doing work against Dakota Access are DSA and stuff. But I don't feel oh, they're doing the work. So that for me was enough. But I don't feel I have necessarily all that historical background. You're talking about how this empowers people. How do these things go hand in hand?
I think the main way to judge the left is who's doing the work, because it's definitely true that for too long the left had were just study groups on college campuses. And, I thank the lucky stars that I'm able to be part of a left that's not just that in the United States. I do think that, again, the socialist movement in its history has always had this kind of really deep, vibrant culture of discussion, newspapers, mass circulation newspapers, theoretical journals, a whole kind of top to bottom culture of learning and discussion, debate. And I think that in part distinguishes us from mainstream politics. There's this great, in one of the New York Times stories on the DSA, it was a year ago or something, they were interviewing someone, I think it was maybe from East Bay, and And she was talking about how, like, well, I got involved in activism, and at first I was kind of hanging around, like, progressives and Democratic Party, and then I became involved in DSA. And one of the things I like so much about DSA is I went to socialist study groups, and I learned, like, what do we stand for? And you can't do that in the Democratic Party. Like, you don't, like, there's a kind of just maybe shared set of underground assumptions, but we don't really have these discussions or debates.
So I want to add something onto that, and I think it feels good to have knowledge, of course, but I think knowing something about the history of socialism, how capitalism works, and how socialism has failed in many cases previously gives us a better idea about how to go about our practical activity. So when we're in committees trying to figure out what our campaigns are going to be trying to achieve and how we're trying to achieve them, we have this resource of history and theory to draw upon in making our decisions that probably, hopefully, will let us do things better than our predecessors have.
Yeah, and so like definitely one of the very theoretical parts of that and kind of, the beginning history, a lot of this, you had a discussion about Marx and capital. So that, that's taking something that seems very complicated and, how do you, break those kind of things down for people? I understand you read, an excerpt from Wage, Labor and Capital. So like, how do you choose what excerpts to focus on, and then how do you kind of break down these really theoretical subjects? That sounds like a whole class. I'm sure there's whole courses being taught on that. And so how do you kind of do it in these couple hour sessions with 60 people in the room?
I mean, I guess a few things. Like, we were really blessed with amazing speakers and facilitators. So one of the things we did early on was do a call out to people to kind of open up the sessions. And then, generally the sessions we would have kind of an opening mini lecture kind of talk. And then there would be some Q&A. And then we'd do breakout groups where people in smaller groups would get to discuss the readings, discuss the issues. And then we'd come back together at the end. It went in and out of that format over time, but it was the general format. And I think so most of many of our leading teachers were just really good at doing that breakdown, and we I think in talking to people and training them, I think the big idea is like taking complex ideas and making them as sort of easy to follow as possible for anyone who wants to participate. Like, we want the sessions to be, serious but accessible. And so, for something like Marx's Economics, Wage, Labor, and Capital, actually, interestingly, is a great text to read because it already was a set of lectures that Marx did for working class audience. So they're not, Capital Volume 1, which is, I think, they say it was like the Bible of the working class. Lots of working class people read it. Who knows? But it's not impossible to read. But it's a big book. It takes more time. It's more of an investment of your whole mental effort. I think Wage, Labor, and Capital is a much simpler introduction. So that's part of, I think, why that was chosen. And then the person who chose that, Niall Reddy, he sort of just gave a great lecture, just breaking down some of the basics. There's exploitation, the dynamism of capitalism and technological innovation, and the continuing conflict of interests between workers and capitalists, and then connecting those three ideas, trying to show how they work their way throughout Marxist thought, but then, come to contemporary society, how these are really characteristic of the system.
Yeah, and you kind of touched on this a little bit, but if this is something people are interested in, they're a new reader, how do you recommend they go about tackling that subject?
Yeah, this is always like the 64. Going to political education, I think, is part of it, honestly. That ideally, that's kind of what we're doing and what everyone in all the branches that's involved in Polyed is doing. I think, we've been trying in North Brooklyn to collect more kind of introductory texts. So we did a study group on Socialism Seriously, which is an introductory text to just basic socialist ideas. The ABCs of Capitalism that's produced, I think, out of this building by Jacobin and Catalyst. Those are some of the intro texts. Were there other ones we had on our list?
I think those were the main ones we had, and kind of piggybacking off what you said. I feel like one of the reasons why having night school and like all these study groups are so great is because like sometimes when you're tackling like something that seems hard and you're kind of struggling alongside other people and like kind of working through it, it's like sometimes it's really there's like something really good about like working things out like as a group. That has been, I think, one of the really positive things to come out of North Brooklyn political education.
So you're listening to Revolutions Per Minute on listener-sponsored WBAI in New York City, broadcasting at 99.5 FM and streaming on all your favorite podcast app. You can find us anytime on Twitter at NYCRPM. I'm Lee Zishi. I use she, her pronouns, and today we're talking about political education and the New York City DSA's night school and some of their reading groups, which is what we're going to kind of dig into next. We've got 3 guests in the studio today, all part of the North Brooklyn Political Education Group. So I kind of want to talk to some of you about, like, what are you reading? So, Jeremy, I've been told that you're a member of a lot of different reading groups. So what reading groups are you a part of right now, and what are you reading?
Well, so right now I've been sometimes going to Lower Manhattan has been doing I think it's, what do they call it, like an advanced strategy group, something like this. And they've been doing kind of short readings that are at a certain like level of, are not meant for introductory work basically, but they've done readings on social democracy, like from a book from the 80s called Social Democracy as a Historical Phenomenon, and a recent article on the Democratic Party and from Socialist Register, and kind of the difficulties the left has had with the Democratic Party, why it's been so tough for leftists to change the Democratic Party. So I've done that group. I've done, like, I was one of the founders of NYU YDSA, and we did a Capital Volume 1 study group. So that was, that was the big book. And we did it over the summer, and it was a lot of fun, actually. We said we were going to make T-shirts, but did make it cover to cover. In North Brooklyn, we've had reading groups, like I said, on Socialism Seriously. We have one going now on Capital City that maybe someone else can talk about because I didn't go to the first one. We've done on Harvest of Empire. We did on Hammer and Hoe about Alabama communists in Alabama in the 30s. What else?
Fear City.
Oh, Fear City, yes. So we've had a lot in North Brooklyn, which I think, is a testament to our organizers, our political and our branch that just wants to learn and is interested in these matters. So, and I guess we think of the reading groups as places where you can do kind of a deeper dive. So night school, I think there's like, if you're just first starting to get to know socialist ideas, then there's night school, which is kind of a longer program and still like introductory, but a little deeper. And then reading groups are kind of more specialized, specific to different topics.
Yeah, that was kind of, my next question. Like, I know my mom's in like a book club and she gets together with the ladies in her neighborhood and they drink a bunch of wine and they kind of read very like entertaining books. So like, how is this like different than that? And kind of like, what are the benefits that you've seen either personally or from other people about being a member of a reading group?
It's an interesting question. It's just like part of, I feel like, my way of life on the left. I've been doing it for so long now. I think, maybe there should be more wine, but I think it's a place where people develop a common understanding. People come from kind of all over. They get to go more deeply into a topic or a matter of concern. I think, we've often seen, like Ben was saying about the night school, we've often seen it turn into people from the reading groups become more involved in other aspects of DSA, feel more confident in the campaign work they're doing. Like Ava was saying, there's just this collective effervescence.
Yeah, when we did Harvest of Empire, I remember I facilitated one of the sessions. Harvest of Empire is a really good book that I'd also recommend. About the history of Latinos in the U.S. And even though like it's not explicitly leftist, there's still like you can read it from a leftist perspective. It's kind of more progressive, I would say, but it's not really, yeah. And even after that sessions, like people kind of linger after too, and people kind of like discussion is over, and we have 2 hours. But after that, people kind of just like, you keep on having these conversations, and like sometimes you'll have people email you. Like I facilitated a session and I had one member be like, hey, like this was really interesting. Like I want to learn more. And also like emailing you further, and like you can kind of, I think that's the benefit of kind of just like reading like together, and you'll have people recommending other readings that you hadn't learned about, so it kind of like everyone has so much knowledge. I think it's like a really important part of like all of these like reading groups and night school. It's just like also like learning from each other, like not from like a like a prescribed syllabus or like a teacher in school. It's kind of like a sharing of ideas.
A socialist sharing, not a hierarchy of this is the information, you have to learn it. And then you go down the rabbit hole and you can never, live your life just blissfully enjoying capitalism again.
I mean, I do that. The capitalism, the Capital Volume 1 reading group, I do think it is sort of like that book. And there are some books like that where it's just like you don't think quite the same way after you're done with them. Like, and you had these maybe impulses or intuitions, but you didn't kind of see how they fit together in a more systematic way. So it's like, okay, I get why, even though capitalism is always dynamically evolving technologically, it still has these like incredibly, these forms of exploitation, people wearing diapers, in Tyson on the factory lines that seem to have nothing to do with how supposedly advanced it is. Like, how did those things happen? How is it so, on the one hand, seemingly progressive and also so regressive? And Capital Volume 1 like really just digs quite deeply into how those things go together. And I think, we just look around us in the world and we have a sense that they kind of both are true of this society. And then you kind of deepen your understanding. You're like, oh, wow, I can't really see things in the same way again.
Ben, as Jeremy mentioned, one of the reading groups right now is reading Capital City by Sam Stein. Can you give us a little brief synopsis of that?
Yeah, so I haven't finished the book yet. I've only gotten through the first 2.5 chapters. But yeah, it's a book that's written from the perspective of urban planning, which is basically in the center of the capitalist value accumulation process here in New York City and other urban areas. Sam is making an argument that that we've transitioned from manufacturing centric capital production as a primary engine of capitalism to more of a real estate centric model. And talking about how that looks from the perspective of a city planner and the kind of contradictory choices that city planners have to make in order to, on one hand, try to make their cities better places, and on the other hand, kind of pulled along in the current of capital, whether they want to or not. But I haven't gotten to the, next 2 sections. So But Sam's Sam will come to our reading group this coming week, and we'll be able to ask him some questions. And I think it's great when we can actually get the authors to come and speak to us because, they know the material best, and there's a lot that may not actually have made it into the book that they are able to share with us in that form. So I'm excited for this next session.
Yeah, why was that book chosen? Or what's kind of the process of choosing what y'all are going to read?
We don't have a very formal process. We just have a bunch of people who show up to the North Brooklyn political education meetings, and various books are suggested, and then people seem to be really excited about one or another, and that's basically how all of our books have been figured out. Also, it helps to know that the author is around and easy to get a hold of. So that was true for Sam. That was true for Capital City. I forget the author of that one. Fear City.
Kim Phillips.
Right. And some other books that we've read too.
And Eva, in addition to your work with the history of decolonization, can you tell us about some ways you've helped other caucuses and working groups in the past as a member of political education?
Well, what, I'm sorry, could you?
Yeah, just like any other work, in addition to, you talked a lot about the history of decolonization, just other work with other working groups or caucuses that you've done with political education.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm also part of the Emerge Caucus, which is a local caucus within DSA. And right now we're kind of also working on putting together kind of a reader that we would like to put out with some and like kind of we have a website with our points of unity that we all agree with. So like we are working on kind of putting together this reader, kind of explaining all of these points of unity more in depth. And so we put together like one of the pamphlets that we've put together is about like abolitionist organizing. So like what does abolitionism mean in practice? What does that look like in terms of like no new jails and kind of decarceration? So we're kind of working right now on getting all of these like kind of introductory readings, like all these like I don't know how to explain it very well, but so for example, like we have one of our other points of unity is for a communist horizon. So like what does a communist horizon look like in practice? So that's also like some of the work that I'm doing within Emerge.
That's great. So you're listening to Revolution Per Minute on listener-sponsored WBAI in New York City, broadcasting at 99.5 FM and streaming on all your favorite podcast apps. You can go to Simplecast and you look up Revolutions Per Minute. We have a lot of episodes on a lot of the different topics that we've kind of been briefing on today. This history that then DSA organizes around. But we have about 15 minutes left of the show, so we want to open up the lines to our callers. Maybe you have some questions about becoming a literate socialist, or, questions about the political education behind the work we're doing. So if you want to call in, the number is 212-209-2877. Again, that number is 212-209-2877. We would love to hear from you. I have a question for y'all, like, as you're kind of building this material, I mean, a lot of it is, I don't know, like, have you ever had, like, good examples where you can, like, really see it taking hold and people, like, understanding something differently and then putting that to practice and organizing?
Hold on, make sure your radio's down. Get the next caller, okay?
Well, I would say that we had that with Socialism Seriously that we had. Socialism Seriously, it's written by a member of what was formerly ISO. The author's name is Danny Catch. So I had a good comrade of mine. His cousin was kind of socialism curious. So he came to our reading group and he like read Socialism Seriously. He said he like read it in an hour, and then after that he was like, he works in tech, and he's like, I will never be able to like look at my workplace the same way again. And like he was like, I've gone down this rabbit hole. So it was a really cool like example of, he was just like literally like his mind was blown. He was like, I need more. And now he's an active member of Central Brooklyn, so that's really rad. Yeah.
I mean, I guess I would say like some of the people who've come, like we've had a few also stories with night school and other things where people have kind of come into it through political education. They've been like, what is this socialism thing? I don't know if I'm ready to join, but I'm interested in learning more. And then they join. And for me, I mean, the joining is great, but also that they feel confident enough to go out canvassing because they feel like they have a kind of basic understanding of like what socialist values are. Like, I mean, sometimes people, I think in study think that like the goal of like theory on the left is to make things more complex. And actually, like, I think we're successful. I mean, the world is complex, so you got to think. But like, I think the work we do is successful. And I think I've heard from people saying they feel that way when you feel confident enough in your ideas that you can then go back out and speak to ordinary working class people about capitalism.
I think there's also something about learning history and theory that is inspiring to people. There's a lot of disillusionment and hopelessness out there, especially among people our age who just feel like there's nothing that can be done. And when you understand how our system, how capitalism works, how our state system works, how the economy works, and how other other people in other times have tried to change that and been more or less successful in doing that, you can see how that might be possible now. And I think it gives people an understanding of what they're fighting for and what the horizons of their struggle are. So I think that can be incredibly liberating and enlivening for activists.
Yeah, and let's see what our callers have to say. You are now live on WBAI.
Hi, how are you? I'm interested in the groups. I have to tell you a little bit about my history. I belonged to DSA, I'm still DSOC, and was even chairperson of the New York local. It's interesting you talked about Allende. I left because of a disagreement I had with Michael Harrington, who thought Allende was too radical, and the Communist Party, because they wouldn't take over the copper industry, didn't invite the catastrophe that happened. And I felt it was hopeless when the organization was led by people who were much older, and I didn't want to stay and be oppositional. And I've been active, although I hate the word activism, because I'm sure the people working for Trump also consider themselves activists. And I think socialist and Marxian and even anarchist education, I consider myself a syndicalist at this point, is really important. I live in North Brooklyn. I've been running some study groups of my own. One of the people is now in Kurdistan, organizing with them. Two of them are in France, working with the Yellow Jackets. And I'm trying to consider, I'm much older than most of the people. I joined the Student League for Industrial Democracy 3 years before it became SDS. And there seems to be a culture of young people that I use different language, I live a different life, I don't have a connection to the internet by choice because I want to live a slow life with time to think and talk to people face to face. And I would like to know how someone like me could interface with DSA, or even if you want to interface with me.
Well, I think we would definitely like to interface. Any thoughts on that?
Well, one thing maybe, I'd be interested in hearing if this was some of what you were thinking, but I definitely think, our work, whether it's the more intensive study groups, which are open to DSA members and, you'd be more than welcome to attend. We're also hoping in North Brooklyn to be doing more and more outward-facing events, too, that draw in more members of the community as well. So maybe town halls around issues on Bernie Sanders' platform and campaigns, issues that really kind of expand. I mean, our big idea is, both intensity, but also expanding the reach of these ideas. So maybe that would be one place also to plug in, because that's our hope, to be a real public education space.
When is the next North Brooklyn meeting or reading group?
So the next branch meeting is on Tuesday night at 7. The next Capital City reading group is this Sunday at 1. And the next night school meeting will be September 23rd.
And where do those happen at, if this gentleman is interested? Because I know that a lot of people can find this online, but he mentioned he is not online.
So the North Brooklyn meeting and I believe the night school planning meeting will be at Mayday Space, which is right off the DeKalb Avenue L, or a short walk away from the Myrtle Wyckoff ML. And I am not sure about the Capital City Reading Group.
Capital City Reading Group is going to be at the McCon Public Library this coming Sunday at 1 o'clock in Bed-Stuy.
All right, and so we have another caller on the line. Caller, you are now live on WBAI.
Thanks for taking my call today. I was unfamiliar with your organization. It sounds very interesting, and I'll definitely be doing my own research. I am an activist with Extinction Rebellion NYC. In fact, we just kicked off a neighborhood group in North Brooklyn. And if you're unfamiliar with us, our focus is climate ecological disaster. It's a global people's movement. to address the crisis that we're in. And my question, because many of the terms and things that you're looking at in your own conversations, be it capitalism, colonization, and so forth, these are really big parts of the conversations that we are having as climate activists, because they all really fold into one another. And so my question may be a little bit off topic from how you approach your own work, but I'm curious if you are looking at the subject through the lens of our current climate and ecological disaster, and if the reading materials support that, if you've seen things historically. I'm just curious, in my humble opinion, it's the biggest crisis of our day. So I just want to know where the group may sit in that regard, and if that conversation is a part of what you're looking at.
No, yeah, definitely. At least I know in my work with decolonization, we're also looking at, obviously, in Puerto Rico, we had Hurricane Maria, which was one of the biggest climate disasters in the past century, I would say. And so we're looking at, I'm planning on working on kind of look how the island can move forward. The new eco-socialist groups that are starting on the island, the new agricultural resurgence from an eco-socialist lens, and also kind of looking at the growth. I know that I believe the night school we had a session on eco-socialism. You can correct me, maybe one of you can expand a little bit more on that, but that's definitely something that we talk about and discuss in North Brooklyn political education.
So DSA has a pretty big and active eco-socialist working group, and they are doing various projects, including trying to make ComEd public utility. And I'm not so active in that group, so I don't know that much about all the various things that they're doing. But yeah, it's a big part of what DSA does in general. Specifically, Night School has had a session devoted to climate change, and it comes up in other sessions all the time. So people are constantly talking about it and asking about how the structure of capitalism is contributing to the reason why we're unable to do anything about the climate catastrophe so far, or how neoliberalism specifically brought that world into being, or helped moved it along much faster than it was already moving. We are focusing on it specifically in various areas, but it's all around the conversation.
Yeah, and if you're interested in learning more about the eco-socialist working groups, public power campaign, and trying to take over Con Ed, we've done a couple different episodes on that, so I would definitely check them out. Do you have something you want to add, Jeremy?
I was just briefly going to say, I think, one thing we do in night school too, well, first of all, I totally agree that it's the crisis of our day and all possible human life is what we're talking about here. And as I like to point out to my students, we don't know there's any extraterrestrial life, so we might be talking about all life when we talk about life on this planet. One thing we do sometimes is distinguish between what do socialists have in common with liberals and liberal approaches to certain social problems, and where do we differ. And I think climate change is the climate change session was one place this came up a lot, and there's been more kind of writing around this. Robert Pollin had a really good piece in the New Left Review not that long ago. In the most recent issue of Catalyst, there's a piece by Matt Huber, I think, just about sort of the need to transition the movement from a consumer individualist-faced movement to a social movement working class movement that makes demands on the actual causes of the destruction of our world, which are powerful capitalists pursuing their profits as well as their luxury consumption. And so part of, I think, what we were doing in our night school is saying we have this social problem. Socialists approach it in a specific way, which is analyzing what capitalism has to do with it, building a working class coalition and a working class movement to organize and fight and eventually overcome the crisis through the Green New Deal.
Well, thank you all so much for being on and for all the work you're doing to educate people so they can get out there and organizing. You've been listening to Revolutions Per Minute. If you want to find the next reading group meetings, you can check out the New York City DSA events calendar to learn more at www.socialist.nyc. This has been Revolutions Per Minute, and we'll talk to you all next Tuesday.